Hi everyone, here we have the classic bouncing ball tutorial. This is a great tutorial that sort of every beginner animator must go through. This is a really handy lesson for those of you who want to get started in Maya and learn a little bit more about the graph editor. Just head over to our website and you can download the rig and this animation scene as well and follow along at home. Alright, hi everybody, let's get into this bouncing ball rig. If you do have ZooTools, you can grab the bouncing ball rig from the Maya Scenes browser right here. Just load that up, it'll come up something like this. Now click on this little guy here, and the rig is in a ZooRigs manual, this little one here. Now if you can't see it here, that's because we're in the Arnold renderer and these rigs are just Maya based rigs. You can also go all, that will just show everything. That is the rig. This is the animation file here, so we'll just double click it and continue on. Now when the rig comes in like this, the background is designed to be black, so just go Alt-B. I am on the hotkeys here. Because we're doing a beginner tutorial here, I'm switching away from the ZooTools default hotkeys and we're switching back to my default hotkeys here. Now this little guy here, this is our viewport rig here. If you are using this scene and you don't have ZooTools, that is part of our viewport, and you can create that for every scene automatically, but I'll just turn it off. So the viewport light's still working here, but it's just been turned off here. I'm also going to make the ground, you can select the ground there. It's just a plane with a grid texture on it. I'm just going to switch that to reference. That just means I can't select that anymore. Might as well turn off the geometry. That just means I can't select the ball now as well. That's that little icon up there. If it's hiding, you just click it out like that. Now we can only select the controls in the scene. The last thing I'm going to do just looks a little bit nicer in the Stingray tone map legacy, because this scene has been built in Maya 2020 and above. That's just so that I can go backwards. So we've got legacy color space here. Don't worry about that too much. We'll just go Stingray, makes it look a bit nicer, not that new Asus stuff. Now we can just press play and you can see that we have our bouncing ball that is in the scene. That's all ready to go. So we want to actually recreate this entire bouncing ball, and I'll do it a little bit differently to how I animated it the first time. I'm doing it in a bit of a more formulaic way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to delete all the animations. I'm just going to select everything here, and we're going to go to the last frame. Now hold shift and then click and drag, and that will make everything red. Right click and we can delete all the keys in the timeline. What's happened now is this animation no longer has any animation on it, so that's no good. But what we can do is select everything, and then just in these guys, so I'm just clicking and dragging only from the translate X down. I'm just going to type 0. That's just resetting the whole rig. Now we can type 1 in the scale as well, but I have scaled this rig up to 5 units. That's just to make it look a little bit nicer on the grid, so that's fine. We're just going to go with that. So now we've got basically the default rig in the scene ready to go. It has been referenced for any of you guys that are used to that, so you can reference this rig in and set this up yourself, but let's keep moving. So now what we want to do is we want to animate this guy. We want to make it go up and down and bounce around. So we're going to come into the graph editor straight away and sort of set up our scene. So to open the graph editor, I'm going to hold down the space bar and then come up to the top quadrant here, and then we'll just go right to the left here. That's Pers graph, and that will bring up our graph editor. That's the fastest way getting into this, and you can be really quick with that and just go there when you're an animator. Now this is a beginner tutorial, but I do expect you guys to have a little bit of keyframing knowledge, just some basics. Should be able to navigate Maya and things like that. We will be using the graph editor. This is a graph editor tutorial, which I sort of do explain a little bit later in my beginner training, so don't be too bamboozled if this goes a little bit quick. So now we're going to select that control. So there's a bunch of controls on this. Let's just explain how this works. This one here is the main control. That's what's going to, the ball bounces around with, is that big purple one. This guy we're not going to be using at all. It's sort of an offset control there that we won't be using in this particular case. This guy here, that's for usually the God control or the main root control. It's the one that you use to position your animation. We're not going to be touching it today. This guy here, this spins around the ball, and you can spin it in any direction. It doesn't really matter which way that goes. These two controls, these little circles on the top and the bottom, those guys are the squash and stretch controls. So you can grab each one and move them up and down, and that will go through up and down. So obviously W for move, and it's E for rotate, as a reminder. 101 Maya stuff. Okay, so with that coming down like that, you can still grab this control here and spin it around, and that's how that works. So let's get straight into this now and see how it all goes when we put it together. Now, my previous one, my example is actually 46 frames, but we're going to come in and make it 48 frames. Now, I can do that in both of these guys here. That will just make the timeline go from 1 to 48. We're actually going to start at frame 0, so I'm just grabbing the little time slider here and making it go from 0 to 48. And there'll be 2 bounces, I believe. So once we've done that, now we can start to keyframe. So we're going to key him at frame 0, it's frame 20, and at frame 24. So let's do that. Now, one of the ways that you guys will be familiar with keyframing is just hitting S. So you can do that on my ZooTools hotkeys. It's Shift S as well. That's not in the defaults, just anyone using Zoo. Now, if we want to do this just on the thing that we're actually using, in this case, we just want to move it up and down. So we don't need to hit S. We can actually just hit Shift W. So W is for move, remember. Shift W will key only the translates rather than keying the whole lot here. So we can come along now to frame 20 and key that again, and that frame 24 will key that again. So we've got 3 keyframes, 0, 20, and 24. Now we want to move it up, and that will be at frame 10. So go back to frame 10, and then you can move back a little bit because we need a little bit of height here. And we'll zoom, sort of just move it up so that we can see any sort of distance. I've got 16.254, but it can be any distance that you like. And that's now coming up in the air like that. Now, if we were to play this now, we can go Alt-V is play. And you can see it just does a little bounce there and nothing. It's not looking particularly great. You can also hit the play button down here. These are your controls. That's just how that works. So we're going to fix this up a little bit and keep going. So now what we can do is in the graph editor, we can come across here to the translate Y. This is the up and down. So if you look at the manipulator, we've got the up and down there. That's this guy here. So if we pull this up and down, you'll see that it'll be moving up and down with it. Now to move something in the graph editor, a couple of things just really quickly. Alt and middle click, that'll pan around here. Alt, Shift, and go in one way. We'll do it on one axis. So that's holding Alt and Shift. And then Alt and Shift up and down, we'll zoom that way. So you see me doing that a lot. So I sort of Alt middle click, Alt right click that is, sorry. We can now move this by hitting W. So W is move in this view, but it's also move in this view. Now, if you middle click, you can't just sort of drag that around. Oh, you can these days. I'm sort of old school, so I'll middle click that. And you can also middle click it from anywhere. So you can middle click over here. It's a good thing to get used to in the graph editor. Also Shift. If you hold Shift down, it's the way you first go will snap it to that axis. So you'll see that we have our grid snap on there. That just means if we go sideways, it'll snap to keys. That's really good in this case. And if you go Shift and then left and right, it'll snap to those keys, which is numerical sort of keys. You can see here, it's like 11 is there and 12 is there. You can see it's snapping to 11, snapping to 12. It doesn't want to snap to the half keys. So we can just go Shift up and down. With a middle click, we'll snap that. That's what I'm doing there. With the W, which is the move mode. Now, I don't have my icons showing over here, which you can click as well. I'm just going to come in here because I've got my own custom mode. Now, you can go into animation and stuff, but we're just going to keep this really simple. And I'm going to go reset current workspace back to the general one. So we'll just go reset. That will just back this. All I've done is I've closed the outliner so we can't see that. Now we've got this guy back here. And pretty much our UI is identical. To get the graph editor back, we just go spacebar up and to the left, and we're back again. So now that we're here, let's do a little bit more. We want a little bit more fancy than this. So I'm going to click on the translate Y, that is the up and down. And I'm going to come in and on these 2 keyframes, this one's not so important. I'm going to hold Shift and box select around. So that just means I can add, and I've got 2 keyframes. Now in the graph editor, make sure you're always box selecting. What I find people and students do a lot is they'll click on it like that. Now, it's just sort of a good habit to get into with Maya is that that's not such a great idea. It's just much better to go Shift and then box select everything. And you'll see when I am moving these tangents in a bit, I'll also box select. So now that we've done that, we want to actually make these keyframes linear. We want to actually break them. So I'm just going to hit the break tangent buttons. That's the guy. It's this little V. And now what happens is if I just select one of these guys, you can see that I can grab it and now it's like a straight V. We're breaking the tangents. If that is not broken, those two, we can come back and unify those tangents there. It just means that when I select this guy here, now when I move it, this tangent will always sort of move the same and it can't be broken. So that's why I've done that there. So we're going to hit that break. We'll break it on this one here, even though it's not so important there because we don't have anything over here. And now what I'm going to do is with those two keyframes sort of selected, you can see they've got tangents. So now I can do a little box select through the tangent, through the middle of it. That's a bit different to what beginners will do. And box select through the middle of the tangent there. That's just a good little trick for selecting tangents rather than clicking on them. Now it's the same thing if you want to move them. What I'm going to do here now is I'm just going to middle click in the middle of these guys and go straight up. Okay, so just make sure you're in move, which is W. And we're going to go middle click and straight up like that. Now if you go left and right, it can go a bit weird. So just move it straight up along that line. And we want to get it so it's really like this really nice C shape on the side. Something like that is going to be nice. Now what this is going to give us is the kind of the ease in and out quickly. So we're actually coming down hard and we're easing in and out of the top. And we're coming down really quickly and out really quickly as you would do on a bouncing ball. So I'm going to move through this fairly fast. I don't want to get caught into too much explaining, but this is definitely the advantage of the graph editor is that you can use graphs in order to have like gravity. So wherever the line is going much steeper, like the steeper the line is basically the faster your object is moving. The more that you're going on the top of the curve and it's not moving so much, like that's pretty plateau, means that the object really isn't moving. And if we come down here between these two keyframes here, the object is completely static. So we'll see this when we play. So now we can play this guy. And you can see it sort of does a little bounce, but just stops. Now between these two keyframes here, if we go K, and that's V on my Zootools hotkeys, but if we go K on my hotkeys, you can drag along here. You can also just click on this guy as well. I'm so old school, I'm always clicking like this. And the thing that's K, that's holding K down if you see me doing that. Now between these two keyframes, we can see that it's absolutely static. There is no up and down movement on that object, so that's important. All right, so let's keep moving. Now the next thing is we want this guy to keep bouncing. So we're going to just drag a box again through the whole curve like that. Now what that will do is select the whole curve. It selects every keyframe on the curve as opposed to selecting a box around a keyframe. This little dot is a keyframe. And that will mean that the whole curve is selected. It's just a little good easy way there of selecting the curve. And now we can hit this second last icon here and just click on that guy. And you can see post infinity cycle there. Now what that will do is it will just keep it bouncing. So now when we press play, we've got two bounces in this timeline to frame 48, which is up here. And we can hit play, which is Alt V. Now that certainly doesn't look like a great animation still, and that is because we're missing one key component of this bouncing ball animation. This is a squash and stretch rig, so we're going to have the squash and the stretch happening on the down. So if we drag this guy, as we come across, the ball goes up and then comes down really hard like we want. If it was a hard ball, it would just bounce straight up again. It would only hit the ground for one frame and then it would keep bouncing. But because we're going to do this squash and stretchy sort of animation, we want it to hit the ball and then really squash into this down area here, and then stretch back up into the next bounce. So let's see how we can do that. That's sort of the up and down motion finished. And we'll come into these two controls here. So we've got two little round controls there. We've got the one on the bottom there and the one on the top. And I'm going to key those. Again, we want to key them on just the translation. So we can do Shift W on frame 0. And then we'll scrub along and do a couple of things. So let's go on to frame 20. Also set that again, and then on frame 24, set it again. So there are all our frames where it sort of like contacts the ground, and then takes off. So now what we want to do is on frame 1, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. We're going to start adding our squash and stretch. So as we take off, I'm going to come in here and grab this bottom guy there, and bring it right down until it sort of intersects into the ground, like right there, as you can see. So now that that's on the ground there, I can key it again with Shift W, and you'll see now that we've got this sort of thing happening on frame 0 and frame 1. It comes off the ground. Now that's a little bit strong, so I'm just going to come in here and bring this down a little bit here to that sort of a shape. So Shift W again on this control. So we've keyed both of these controls on this frame. Now we're going to come across 3 more frames. So 1, 2, 3 onto frame 4. And we want to sort of resolve this back into the perfect ball. So the way to do this is to select that top control there and the bottom one, and then come in and click and drag down and then hit 0, like type 0 with a numeric numpad or in the numbers. that will mean that this is returned now to the perfect 0 shape that we started with. And we can now hit Shift W. Just middle click back in a view. If you're typing Shift W there, you don't want to be doing that. You can just middle click in any of these views and then hit Shift W, that will key it. And now we're back to this. So from frame 0, you can see it's on the ground. Now we're going to come up and go frame 1. And as it takes off, it's sort of like coming back to its normal shape. Right, and this will make more sense in a little bit. So I'm going to cruise ahead up to frame 90. Now what I want to do is I want to start copying some frames. So when it hits, I want it to stretch. So this is really a stretch frame here at frame 1. I want it to stretch. So that's not a squash frame yet, but it's just stretching. And we want that stretch frame to also be the frame before we hit the ground. So what I can do, a couple of things, is we can grab that and try Control C and Control V. We'll copy and paste those curves there. If that's not working very well for you, you can also try over here, you can drag from that frame there, you can middle click drag. So instead, what I would do is hold the K key and then middle click drag, or middle click drag in the timeline. So K key in this case, I'm just holding the K key down and then I'm middle click dragging across to frame 19. And then we can hit Shift W. Now what that does, you'll see that if we're middle click dragging, the timeline is not moving. So that's quite handy. And that means that we can essentially copy the position of these two controls at that frame. And then we're going to hold down K and then we're going to copy that frame all the way across to frame 19 there. And we just hit Shift W again. Now that's going to look a bit odd. So we need to make sure that this animation here, 3 frames before, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, is the perfect ball shape. Now there's a couple ways I can do that. Again, I could just grab those and hit 0 and then key that. So that's one way of making that 0 in the perfect ball shape. If we step forward and back again, so we scrub a little bit, that'll return to what we had. Now the other thing I can do is I can grab this keyframe here and go Control C, Control V. We'll copy and paste that. So this is the second way of doing it. And then the third way of doing that is we can move back to here and then with the K key held down or in the timeline, I can middle click drag to that frame. Now we're going to go 3 frames back. So 1, 2, 3 at frame 16 and then hit Shift W. That's the third way of copying a keyframe in Maya. So that's kind of handy. Nice little graph editor tutorial here. Now that that's happening, what we'll see is that we've got a little bit of squash and stretch. So you can see how that's happening. It's quite subtle, and depending on what your playback is like at home, you could be missing it a little bit. But if we were to go through that slowly, you can see it sort of stretches when it takes off, and then it stretches as it's coming back down again. Now, here's the important part. This part where it just stops. This is kind of annoying. So in the middle of these 2 keyframes at frame 20, what I want to do is I want to come in and move that control down into the squash. So just the top control this time, I'm going to come down and squash it quite a bit. So it's quite obvious. And then what we can do is hit Shift W again. So I'm just using Shift W all the time here. Of course, you could be using S, the hotkey for that as well. But that will just mean that that has now come down into that squash frame there on frame 22. So if we're to scrub a little bit here, we can see as it comes down, it's now squashing into that and then it's coming back up again. And then it's not stretching here. So there's a reason why it's not stretching here. I'm just going to use Alt and Shift and then right click and just move this back a little bit. And I'm going to see that if you scrub along here, what you'll see is it doesn't stretch again. And that is because these curves, these 2 little yellow circles here, so I'm selecting 2 circles there, they are not repeating, they're not looping like we were before. So what we need to do is you can also hit F. If you're having trouble framing this, you can hit F and then you can Alt and then zoom back with the right click. Select all the curves. That's one way of doing it, or you just drag through the middle of all of them. We can now hit the second last icon again. That is the cycle. And now this will be cycling, forever. So now as we're playing this, you can see we're starting to get the start of this squash and stretch bouncy ball, which is great. All right, so that's looking great, and maybe that's where a lot of people will stop, but we'll just come in and we'll clean this up. Being professional animator, let's just do the fine details on this and make it really rocking before we make it jump side to side. So I'll just save the scene here. This is a good time to save. File, if you haven't saved already, save scene as. So I'm just saving that ball squash and stretch anim, and I'll just say my anim _01. Alright, so now that that's saved, we're just going to do a couple little animated touches to this, just sweetening it up just a tiny bit, and then we'll start the ball bouncing side to side and see how that works with the ball rolling. Okay, so now we'll come in here and a couple of things. One of them is, it feels a little bit like jelly, this ball, when it comes down. You can sort of see it feels a little bit like jelly. Now what happens is, as we're coming through here and we're coming down and then down here, a ball would not ordinarily really change its shape much at all until it hits the ground. So we've got it sort of stretching, but that's sort of mimicking more of a motion blur sort of an effect, and it's less so what a real ball would actually do. It would just remain round until it hits the ground and then squash. So there's something that we can do there a little bit that I'm not liking. It's just feeling a little bit jelly-like. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab these two frames. So I've just got the two squash controls, the top and the bottom selected, and I'm going to grab this frame 16, and now with shift held down, middle click, and then move that across. Now I've got to go in the right direction first, so we'll go across, and I want to move that right up to frame 18. So there will be a stretch frame, but it's this very last one before it hits. So it's now retaining its shape a lot more before it hits. And if we play that, it's a very small difference. Like, you guys may not be able to see exactly what the difference is, but I can sort of feel it's just got a little bit less of a jelly feel to it. It's feeling a little bit more solid. Now, I did notice when I was doing this before, you could put that on frame 17 as well. That's really not going to feel much different. But when we go right up to here, you'll start to see at frame 12 that the ball will really start to feel like jelly as it comes down. You sort of can see that it feels much more jelly. So I'll just undo that and bring that back to frame 18 there. That's going to feel better. Now, this is me being a little bit more pedantic, but I'm just going to select the top control here now. And I do know as an animator that as the weight of this is coming down, I want this frame here, this frame 21, to be more at the bottom, like it's coming in really quickly, and I want it to slow down at the bottom of that arc. So don't worry about that too much if you're not really sure why I'm doing this. But the way that I would handle this as a professional animator is I just grab those two keys there, and we would just grab the linear tangents there. That will snap them and break them off. And I could just bring that down one at a time in this case. I could do them both together as well. And I just really want to make that bottom really, rounded. So it just means that on the squash frame, it's sort of slowing down and then speeding up into the takeoff. That's just a tiny little thing there. Now, there's one last thing that we can do here, and this is a bit of a hack, but I like to explain this. If we grab the main control, this is the very first thing that we did, the up and down motion. There's a cool thing that you can do, and that is because this is a cartoony sort of a ball, we can break physics a little bit and sort of exaggerate the bounce. So what I'm going to do here is on frame roughly 4, I'm going to put a keyframe. So there's a couple ways you can do this. One is you can just hit Shift W again and key that. Now you'll notice that it does change the tangent a little bit, and there's ways to stop that from happening. But another way that you can do it is you can come to that very first icon here, come across to the Insert Keys tool, and now we can middle click drag, and that will insert a key right there. And what you'll notice is the curve doesn't change. It's only for that curve that we've put it on. So rather than putting it on all 3 keys, you can see that this translate Y now on that frame has gone a bit darker red. That just means that this has a key on it. We can do the same on the other side. So this is like 1, 2, 3, 4 frames along. We can do the count backwards the same way. 1, 2, 3, 4, and just put another key here. So I'm just middle click dragging and then putting it on that curve there. You do need to make sure something in the curve is selected if that's going to happen in this case. So K, because we've got that key there selected. So now that these two guys are selected, what we can do is we can move these around a little bit. So I'm going to move these up. I'm going to hold Shift and then middle click drag up. That just moves them up a little bit until it's a little bit flat. Now we don't want to go too far. We don't want to go like that. We just want to like move them up a little bit, and you can zoom in a little bit here. I'm just using Alt and Shift and the right click. And I don't want to go too far like that, but I just want to really maximize and push them up as far as they can go, sort of like that. And we can sort of exaggerate this down. Now, I'm just going to select this one curve just by clicking on just the translate. And I'm going to grab this here, and I'm just going to move it up a little bit more so it's a little bit even steeper. And this guy here, move it up a little bit steeper. And we can just start to tweak these tangents a little bit. So I'm just box selecting all this stuff, moving them around a little bit to exaggerate this curve more. So we're going to be having a steeper come down, and that will give us a bit more of a cartoony feel. Like that can even come up a little bit more there. You can grab them both. Now that we've tweaked that curve, it can go up a bit further. And we're really trying to push that so it comes up really fast and it comes down really fast like that. It's a bit of an exaggeration. We're always exaggerating in animation, even for more VFX realistic animation, we still exaggerate quite a lot just to make it cool. So now you can feel this is a subtle difference, but the up and down is more hovering in the air. It's got more air time and it's coming down heavier and harder. And that just gives it a little bit more of a spring into the animation. And this is a really good principle that we teach, so that then when you go into your characters and much more complicated animation, you can still do the same sort of stuff, especially in cartoony exaggeration. So that's just a nice little tip there. All right, I've just done another little save there, so make sure you keep saving your files. And I'm going to continue. And we're going to now have the ball jump left and right and do a little bit of a spin, which makes it look really cool, like we did at the start. So now what we want to do is we just want to get this ball bouncing from side to side is best. So we're going to select the big control here. This is this one. And we're actually going to keyframe on the translate X. This means it's going to be this direction. You can see it's red there, color-coded red. That's the translate X guy there. So we select that control and we're going to move it this way and that way. So I'm just going to move it to the left on the first frame, and that's frame 0 in our case, to the left. And we're going to go -5. So I can just type -5. I'm doing that numerically, so you can type in numerical inputs. And then on that frame there, because we've keyed everything already, we can just go Shift W again, and that will keyframe this. Now, if you start to scrub through the timeline now, you'll see that sort of comes over, and then from the top, it now comes down and up. And I'll just press play just to see. It's a bit weird. It's not really doing what we want it to do yet. So what we want here is we want the ball to bounce in a very, very straight line until we get to frame 20, where it's going to contact the ground again. Let's have a look at this. So when it comes down, it's frame 20 that hits the ground. So as it goes in the air, we want this to sort of move across a very even speed until it's the ground. So we can just come in here to frame 10, just drag a box around it, hit delete. That will remove that keyframe. And then select these two keyframes by dragging a big box around both of them. And then we can hit that guy there. That is linear keyframe. So what that will mean is the tangents will always point to each other, and we'll get kind of this very cornered sort of sharp straight lines between keyframes. And what we can see now is when we play this, we get the bounce that we're over. It's sort of like doing a little bounce. But of course, what we want it to do is to bounce backwards and forwards in a nice way. So it sort of stops. But on the way back now to frame 44 in this case, so I'm just going to put another keyframe there. We're just going to go Shift W on that frame here. Now this is going to do a couple of things. I've made a mistake there, but I'll show you what that is we want that frame there when it hits the ground. So I know that it's coming up here in the air, and then it's going to jump up and then hit the ground there. Now, as you can see, I have made a mistake, and that means that it's no longer bouncing. What's happened here is this guy here had a cycle on it, but we've now put another keyframe. So now the repeat is happening from that section. It's repeating again. So we've got to come into the Y keyframe and maybe the Z one too, because we don't really need it. And we just delete the keyframe at frame 44. And that will mean that our cycle continues. You can keyframe just on one attribute at a time. Now, as we're coming back down again to frame 44, we can grab that keyframe there, and then on it, rather than hitting -5 here, we can come into this little guy here. This is a nice little tip. This is a numeric thing. It's sort of the same as doing it there, but you are actually directly moving the curve. And we just type -5 in that second text box there. That's going to move the ball back to where it came from. So we're going to have the ball bounce from here over to the middle and then back again to -5. So now that's done, of course, the ball should be moving in a very even speed between these two. So we'll select through the thing, and we can just make all the keys here linear. And you'll see that that's what the curve looks like. And just to finish this on frame 48, we might as well put another keyframe there. So I'm just going to, in this case, we only want to key this guy here, so we can put a line through that. That second icon there, we'll add a key just on that curve, and then middle click drag to frame 48 is one way of doing that. There's many ways to do it as well. We could also right click and key selected. Okay, now that we've got that, let's have a look at what it looks like. And you can see that the ball is successfully bouncing side to side. Now we want it to bounce a little bit further than that. So on this top frame, rather than it stopping like from -5 to 0, we want it to bounce further along. We want it to bounce to +5. Now, rather than going in and actually like moving it on both those two keyframes, we can just on the x-axis select both of those frames there and then type 5 there. So that what that's done is moved both those keyframes up to 5 high. Now I see that our linear keys are now a bit messed up again. So I'll just put a big box through the middle of a curve and just hit the linear again. That way you'll select all the keyframes and you can just make them all linear. So now what we're seeing is this guy moving further. Now, the good thing about curves is, and this is the real beauty of animating in a CG program, is that you can now like really move these to anywhere. So we can very quickly experiment and have the ball moving further or not at all, like or the other way. So now it's bouncing the other way. So there's lots of different ways, and now we've got this clean setup. We can now modify all this stuff and make the ball bounce higher or left and right more, etc., etc. All right, so now that that's all done, there's one last thing that we want to do. We want to actually have this ball spin a little bit as it's going through the air, and this will sort of sell the reason why it's bouncing side to side. So let's come in here and we're selecting this little arrow guy, the yellow guy. That's going to be spinning it, and on frame 0 we can just put a keyframe there. So in this case we can go Shift E. E is for rotate, remember? So we can go Shift E and that will key the rotate attributes. And then we'll come across all the way to frame 20, key that again, and we want to rotate that this way, 360. So I'll just go negative 360, believe that's the right way, and we can just key that again by going Shift E. Just again, make sure you middle click here and don't type Shift E, just middle click, and one of these views will enable you to go Shift E, and that will key that again in the right way. Hit F and we can get back to there, and I'm just zooming out a little bit. Now what we can see is the ball will roll through the air and to that location. Draw a box through the two curves. Again, we're just going to keep this one linear, so we want it to like really move at an even speed, hit the ground and stop. And then at frame 24, I'm going to hit Shift E again, and then we want that to bounce all the way back on frame 44, which is the contact frame, and we're going to have that zeroed again. So I can just select those guys there, and then zero that out with just typing 0. There's many ways of doing this. I'm just going to middle click back in there, then hit Shift E. That will key that, and then we can drag a box through it again, set it to linear because we're making new keyframes. And frame 48, I want to just do another one, so Shift E again there. That just means if we want to cycle it further, this will cycle. 48 frame cycle, bouncing backwards and forwards. So now that we've got that, there we go. Bob's your uncle. We now have a bouncing ball, bouncing around. Now we can tweak this a lot. We could come in again, and this is now our rotation, like is our Z rotate. And we can see that by coming in here and looking at the Z axis. So you can just like click on that and you'll see that the yellow sort of pops up. It's definitely that axis, the Z axis, and it's spinning. Now we could come into these guys and you see that's negative 360. We could make that like negative 720. So we just go twice as far. Now just be a bit careful when you do type into that. I often type hotkeys, so stuff starts happening. Just make sure your mouse sort of stays in that guy there. One of the things that happened just then when I did type there is I actually typed some numbers, and we actually hit the 1, 2, and 3 keys. Now if you hit these 1, 2, and 3 keys, you'll see that they're controlling these icons up here. And I went into this third mode, which is display curve in normalized view, which will be really annoying actually to be in. So just a little tip there, we've always got to be on this first icon for things to see this up and down values there. That means if I'm to come back here and select what I had then was the rotate guy, I can now see that that has gone to negative 720. Just a little tip there. That's quite annoying if you accidentally hit numbers here and you don't know what mode you're in. That's what those guys are doing. All right, so now that we're here, we've got that bouncing, and the rotating of this guy now is much, much faster, like twice as fast. So of course we can change the speed of this by moving this like quite less steep on the graph curve. And now you can see that that ball is spinning much, much slower there. So there's a lot you can do here, and we can make it go the other way, which would look a bit strange because it's sort of reverse bouncing. If you like that, we can do that too. So this is the beauty of a CG program and the graph editor, and the real power of it is we can do major edits very quickly, have the scene update. So the bouncing ball is a great example of that with the bouncing ball animation in showing off the graph editor. So one last thing here, just that I thought I'd show you, is if we grab this big purple guy that moves the whole thing from side to side, we can now come into this guy here and select both of these curves. Now we want the side to side, say, to be bouncing more in this case. We could go into the scale mode. So I haven't really shown scale yet, but scale is like this guy, hit R, that is the scale mode. Sort of like zoom it and then hover our mouse down in the middle here and then hold shift and then middle click up, and that will scale this curve bigger. And you'll see that now the side to side motion is bigger. Now it looks a little bit strange because of the way that we've done the float animation now that it is moving more. So we could have the exaggeration of the up and down a bit less, but you can see what's happening there. And the reverse of that, of course, is you do the same thing. So this is still with the scale mode, hold shift, middle click, drag down, and now we're just making it bounce a very, very small amount. So I just thought I'd show you that as well. There's one more thing that I'll just explain quickly here too that some of you might have been confused about now that I'm thinking about, is why I put more keys in here. Some of you guys coming from Illustrator or other programs with nice Bezier curves might be like, why didn't you do it the other way? So I will show you that just really quickly now. There is another way of doing this. The reason why I do it this way is because the tangent mode that we're in, if you come into our curves here, we're in non-weighted tangents. That means that we can see little triangles on the end here, and you cannot grab them and grow them. You can't make them longer and shorter. And there's a specific reason why this is the default in Maya. That is because you're often shuffling keys around, and you don't want to get like these broken curves here. So I'll show you how that works. Is we can come in just to this one curve here, the translate Y, and we can grab it, and we can go curves, and we can go now weighted tangents. Now the tangents turn into these little squares rather than triangles. And now we can grab these guys here and move them around. Now, the one thing that's the problem here is if we do grab that and then move it here, you can get these little jaggy lines in your curves quite easily. And that's something that we animators are constantly doing, is we're moving keys around as we're working. And you get these little bad lines. So that's why it's off. Now, you can switch it to be weighted tangents. And now this curve is weighted tangents, and we can do this in a bit of a different way, which might be feel a little bit nicer to some of you guys from Illustrator land and stuff like that. So if I grab that, I can now hold shift and then move that on one axis, and we're getting that beautiful curve that way. Now I'm just an animator, so I end up putting more keys in. It's just my workflow to avoid what I just showed you there. It just means that if we're now rearranging this and making it a bit softer, you can very quickly get into this nasty looking stuff. So I just thought I'd show you that there. That is definitely something to be aware of, and the reasons for why it defaults to non-weighted tangents there. There is some more to this. Obviously, we've got a whole page on Graph Editor. Go through all the settings of the Graph Editor. Very good page, so check that out too. It's free as well. So there you go, guys. That's that. This time just with less keyframes. We're doing the same thing, but with less keyframes. That's just a personal choice. And let's have a look at this. We've got it here, up there. Yep, come back to my Zoo Tools menu to plug our tools. Obviously, we've got our tools, check them out. And we've got lots of cool rigs and obviously stuff that's much more complicated than this, and more free stuff coming as well. So there you go, guys. I hope you enjoyed that tutorial. I'd also like to cover the making of the rig of this. It's actually a really nice, easy rig to make that's got a few fancy things in it. So I might break that down when I can. Well, cheers, guys.